Hi, it's Kevin, and we're going to create a CDS hook service in 10 minutes. So you may be thinking to yourself, what is a CDS hook? So CDS hooks are clinical decision support. That's what CDS means, and then a hook service. So basically, these hooks, they take EHR events, and an EHR event is like when a provider opens a chart, or when a provider is placing an order, like if a provider is placing an order for a CT or an MRI, you could create a notification of this event to this web service, or when a visit starts or ends, you can create a notification to this web service when these events happen in the EHR. These services, they can give cards back to the EHR to display to the provider, right? So all of a sudden you have this little standardized card that shows up that says, hey, that MRI you're trying to order, it costs this much, right? Of note, these are not available for patients, right? These are inside of the electronic health record itself. So they're hooks into events that happen to the providers. So when you're thinking of CDS hooks, like what are some examples? I talked about a cost estimator card that pops up when the event of ordering an MRI happens, or the event of ordering a medication, maybe estimator for how much it's going to cost the patient for this medication that kind of pops up. Maybe it's somewhat headless in that, like when an encounter ends, it notifies the service, hey, this encounter's over, and maybe you want to send a patient satisfaction survey in like 2 days or something, right? You could also create a service that makes like CME appear inside the EHR. Like, if a patient has a history of Alzheimer's, maybe it'll pop up a card that says, hey, there's this great CME for internal medicine docs who happen to be seeing patients with dementia, right? And you can go on and on and on, right? The core concept is that there's this event, and then there's this web service that you control that does something, all right? So to show you how to make one of these, we're going to build the CME service, and I call it CMEster, right? So it's going to make a card that's below. It's going to make it appear in the EHR when a provider opens a chart and the patient has a history of dementia, right? So if the patient doesn't have a history of dementia, nothing pops up. But if they do, this little card here pops up. And this is a little preview. There's a patient in Smart Health IT Sandbox, which is not a real. There are no real patients there. It's all fake made-up data that's hosted by Boston Children's. There's a patient, Daniel X. Adams, this fake patient, and we're going to create this card here inside this gray line. It's going to say, hey, CMEster is saying this patient has a history of vascular dementia, Alzheimer's, dementia associated with another disease, and these are great podcasts about dementia, including Curbsiders. So there's an actual link here to the Curbsiders podcast. Curbsiders is like CME for internal medicine docs, hospitalist docs. And they have this nice episode on dementia made simple. So when there's a provider who's internal medicine who's opening a chart and the patient has a history of dementia, this is going to pop up. But if they don't have a history of dementia documented, nothing's going to happen. All right. You're like, okay, that sounds great, Kevin, but how do you actually do this? So you need two things to get CDS hooks to work. One, you need somewhere to serve your code out for this web service. Like your web service needs to have code somewhere. This could be in Azure Functions, like AWS Lambda, Google Functions, wherever, right? But you need somewhere to serve your code, and then you need an EHR to show these cards in, right? So for the first step, what we're going to do is have a place serve the code, right? So I actually am using REPL today. We've used REPL in the past. You can sign up for a free account. I don't get anything from REPL. I just think they have a cool service. You could go and fork my REPL, and it's right here. So if you click here, you'll see there's a bunch of code that's already started for you. Cool thing about REPL is that there's some files, and there's an index.js here. So REPL can do I think Python, HTML, CSS, Node.js. So we're using Node.js here. There's only one file, index.js. There's a bunch of code here that sets up a little server and gives us some JSON. But the coolest thing about REPL is this little URL here. So this is unique to you, right? So mine is cdshooks.patientdev.repl.co. Yours may be cdshooks.yourname.repl.co. But if you hit run up here and then you open this in a new tab, you'll see that this is actually serving out the code that is specified, right? Kind of in real time, which is pretty cool. To prove this, we could go to this little thing where the app is getting the root and it's sending out your clinical decision support service, exclamation point. We could take away that exclamation point, stop, run, go back over, and now that's gone, right? So pretty easy way of kind of mocking up some code real quick and having a little web server, right? We'll do the rest of the code towards the end about how this actually all works, but if you fork it and you click run, you'll have your own URL here, and you could get something that looks like this, right? So all the code you need for CMEster is actually all set up now. You have a server that's serving it out, so you can hook it into an EHR. So for the EHR simulation, we're going to use the CDS Hook Sandbox. All right, so you should see something like this. And what this is showing over here is like, hey, this is kind of a mock-up of an EHR here, and they have this built-in patient greeting card that's already displaying. So there's a card here that says, you're now seeing Daniel. It automatically loads Daniel Adams, who's a fake patient. And it gives you like some stuff you can do. So you got to imagine that this part is Epic Cerner or whatever. All right. So to hook up your REPL to this fake EHR, you go up to this gear here, you add a CDS service, and then you just take your REPL URL. So mine was cdshooks.patientdev.repl.co. Yours may be cdshooks.yourname.repl.co. So make sure to copy and paste it. Then do a / CDS services and click save. And now you will notice that all of a sudden our little card showed up, right? Which is pretty cool. So that was making a CDS service in less than 10 minutes. But you're probably like, hey, what actually happened there? Like, it's not very helpful. So what we will do is go over here and look at the code next, right? So I set up this code where this is all Node.js, and there's a little server called Express, and then there's something called body parser, which lets you get the data from posts to your server. And we have a little load dash, so you could iterate through things. So what we do is we create this thing, this app, Express app here, and we say, hey, we want to use body parser. And then we set some headers on the response. So if you don't do some core stuff, like the sandbox isn't going to like it. So just keep this here. Just know in the back of your mind, hey, I got to do something about cores here. Right now, this is just kind of wide open. So there's two things you got to set up on the server. So you need to have an endpoint that's called CDS-services, right? And what our CDS services does is it returns this little object. And it says, hey, there's these services here at this server. And when we have this thing called CMEster, and when there's a patient view, which is like the providers opening up the chart, we're going to give you some CME, right? You can specify stuff to prefetch. So we're making a service that shows this dementia CME only if the patient has a history of dementia, right? So we need their FHIR data from condition, because that's like the ICD-9 and 10 stuff, the SNOMED CT codes we could search for dementia, and also some patient information, which maybe we want the patient's name or their age or something like that, right? So we could do something interesting with their age and their conditions, right? So all CDS hooks have this little URL for the CDS services, which is what we registered. And it says, hey, on patient view, do the CMEster stuff and prefetch this stuff from FHIR. What'll happen is when that hook gets called, the EHR will post data to this ID. So you need to have a path called CDS services / CMEaster, which is because our ID here is CMEaster. And then what we do here is we say, okay, like I have this array called dementia, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to search through all the conditions, see if anything matches Alzheimer's or dementia. And if it does, we're going to push in the display of that code into this array so then we could display it to the user. Because it's one thing to show something that says, hey, here's some dementia CME, and the provider go like, that's weird, like, why? And this is the why, right? It's kind of like, it's not explainable AI, it's explainable decision support, right? Like, why did this happen? Well, it happened because the patient has a history of Alzheimer's disease, right? So I set up this little array in the request, in the body, and then something called prefetch and condition. There's a bunch of entries, and we loop through their coding here and log it out here, which is what you see. So on this patient, who's Daniel Adams, has a bunch of diagnoses, I believe, all in SNOMED CT here, but dementia is one of them. So what I essentially do is take display and just match it. You probably want to do something like more sophisticated with like, oh, only these certain SNOMED codes or ICD-10 codes or something like that. But this is just kind of quick and dirty. So what we've done is loop through the prefetch data. You know, if there is a match on dementia, so the dementia array length is greater than 0, we're going to create this card. So the specification for CDS hooks, the link which is at the top of the notion there, says you can create these cards, right? And the summary is CMEaster, and the indicator is success. And if we go here, I believe it gives it a certain color of border when it's success. And then detail is this patient has a history of dementia join with a comma. These are great podcasts about dementia, including blah, right? So what we see here is this patient has a history of what came back through FHIR, prefetch. There are great podcasts about dementia, including Curbsider's podcast, right? So you can have this thing called links, and the label is Curbsider's podcast, which is what gets displayed here. And the URL is here, which was what was in the notion, and the type is absolute, which means it's just going to open a new window. You can also hook into another FHIR app. I believe the type is smart. All right. So if we click here, what'll happen is it'll take us to that podcast on Curbsiders. Right. So you got to imagine you're in the EHR, you click on this, another window opens outside the EHR, and you can read about Dementia Made Simple with Josh Yu. There's also this little source thing, which allows you to have an icon, which is how I got the little icon here, which is hosted on patient.dev. So we send out this dementia card if there is a dementia match. Otherwise, we send out a null object. And then we start that server, and the server is started. So that is the quick and dirty about creating a CDS hook service in 10 minutes. This may have gone a little over with all the explanation behind it, but you definitely were able to fork the code and create the server and wire it up within 10 minutes. So let me know how it goes and reach out to me on patient.dev. Thanks.